Ever get that feeling where you're like, I just want the gist? You know, like
Hmm.
the core of an idea, like
Yeah.
without having to wade through a ton of academic jargon.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's kind of what we're aiming for today.
That's the goal.
Here on the deep dive, we've got these excerpts from a blog called the Taxshila Page,
Okay.
specifically an article titled Command Problems in Conventional Education, Struggle of Learning Commands.
Catchy title.
Yeah, and we're going to try to break it down.
Yeah.
So you can walk away with like the key takeaways,
Yeah.
you know, without feeling like you just sat through a whole semester's worth of lecture.
Exactly. Yeah, you had flagged this for us. And it's interesting because I think it touches on something that I think we've all either experienced or observed firsthand,
Right.
which is, why do students sometimes seem to resist what teachers are asking them to do?
Yeah.
Like, what is that friction about? And I think this article kind of gets into the mechanics of that resistance. And it offers
Yeah,
a pretty radical alternative.
it does. So our mission today is pretty straightforward.
Right.
We want to understand this command problem that the article identifies,
Okay.
right? It's like this friction between what teachers are asking students to do and then how students are actually acting in a typical classroom.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then maybe even more importantly, we want to explore the solutions that are proposed by this whole concept of learnography, which is kind of central to the blog's thinking.
Right. And I think one of the things that the article jumps right into is what it sees as like the fundamental issue,
Okay.
which is that students are not following these academic learning commands from their teachers.
Right.
And it's not just about kids being a little bit fidgety or something like that. The article really argues that it has real consequences and it leads to disruptions in the classroom.
Yeah.
And understandably, a lot of frustration for educators.
For sure.
Yeah.
So let's get into it. Like, what is at the heart of this command problem?
Okay.
The article is basically saying that the traditional classroom, whether we consciously think about it or not, functions on a system of commands.
Yeah.
It's the teacher directing the learning journey through these specific instructions. I mean, think about it. It's like
Yeah.
it's the bedrock of how most classrooms operate.
What's really fascinating, I think, is just how basic yet crucial these commands are.
Yeah.
The article gives us this list, and it's so concrete. And it's things like listening attentively, reading the assignment materials,
Yeah.
taking notes or writing summaries, completing exercises, memorizing key concepts, participating in classroom discussions.
Yeah.
Like when you look at that list, you're like, oh yeah, that's pretty much
It's the essential.
the essential activities of learning in a formal setting.
Totally. And the article makes this point that when students push back on those seemingly straightforward instructions, it has some pretty big knock-on effects. Obviously, like a lack of focus in the classroom,
Right.
but I think more profoundly, it hinders how much knowledge they actually absorb,
Right.
you know? So it's not just a behavioral issue, it's a learning issue.
Absolutely. And I think if you zoom out a little bit,
Yeah.
this kind of resistance,
Yeah.
it creates an overall inefficiency in the education system.
Yeah.
Teachers are spending valuable time managing this resistance as opposed to focusing on actual instruction.
Totally.
And as the article makes clear, it's not just a systemic issue.
Right.
It takes a genuine toll on teachers themselves psychologically.
Which we'll definitely unpack.
For sure.
But first, let's get to why.
Yeah.
Why does the article suggest students are resisting these learning commands in the first place? And this is where they bring up this really interesting idea about the dominance of the limbic system in younger learners' brains.
This is huge.
Yeah.
This is like a core concept in their whole argument.
Okay.
And I think to understand it, we need a really quick overview of the brain and kind of its functional areas.
Okay.
So you've got the limbic system, which is largely about emotions, pleasure, immediate gratification.
Yeah.
Then you've got the cognitive system, which is thinking, reasoning, problem solving. And then finally, the motor system, which is about physical action and learning through movement.
Okay.
So what they're saying is that in children and teenagers, that limbic system,
Right.
that emotional pleasure-seeking part of the brain, it often holds a lot of sway.
Makes sense.
They're drawn to things that offer immediate enjoyment, playing, socializing, entertainment.
Yeah.
And this can create a real conflict with the often delayed rewards of academic tasks,
Right.
like studying for a test or grappling with a really complex concept.
Totally. And that's their central point. That this is why younger learners struggle to fully engage with those learning commands we talked about.
It's like a tug-of-war happening in the brain.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And they also highlight a couple of other key factors that contribute to this resistance.
Okay.
And one is what they call playing behavior and attitudes, which is essentially that many students don't view school as this intensely serious learning environment all the time. You know, it's a social space, a place to interact with friends, to have fun.
Totally. I think anyone who's been in or around a school that resonates.
Yeah.
Like you walk into a structured learning setting with a mindset that's geared towards leisure and social interaction.
Yeah.
Those academic learning commands, they're going to feel like a bit of a bummer.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, it's a clash between what they're expecting and what's being asked of them.
Exactly. And the second point that they raise is a lack of awareness about the purpose of learning.
Okay.
And the author asks this really fundamental question, for whom are we learning, right? And the idea here is that if students don't truly grasp why they're being asked to do these things, if they don't see the relevance to their own lives or their own goals, then they're far less likely to be motivated to follow instructions.
Like it feels arbitrary or like busy work or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So to recap, they're laying out this pretty compelling case, right?
Yeah,
You've got the limbic system pulling them towards instant gratification. You've got this tendency to view school as kind of a social playground.
Yeah.
And then this lack of clarity about why they should even bother with academic tasks.
Yeah, it paints a pretty clear picture of why this command problem exists in so many classrooms.
And then they don't shy away from talking about the consequences for the individuals who are trying to guide that learning. For the teachers, they detail the psychological toll that they experience when they're constantly facing students who just aren't following instructions. They list some really tough emotions. Anger, right?
Yeah.
That surge of frustration when students just seem to be ignoring what they're being asked to do. Stress, like the ongoing pressure of trying to maintain order and facilitate learning in a classroom where there's this constant low-level disobedience. And then disappointment.
Oh, yeah.
That disheartening feeling when students just don't seem engaged or interested in what you're trying to teach.
And it's not just fleeting feelings, right?
No, it's constant.
The article emphasizes that repeated exposure to these kinds of challenges, it can really contribute to serious teacher burnout, mental exhaustion, and even like emotional breakdown.
And then think about the wider impact of that, not just on the well-being of individual teachers, but on the overall quality of education that they're able to provide.
Absolutely.
It creates this negative cycle.
Big time.
Okay, so the problem has been defined.
Cool.
Students resist learning commands due to this mix of brain development and attitudinal factors. And this has significant negative consequences for students and teachers. So what does this learnography concept that the blog is advocating for offer as a potential solution?
This is where the article shifts gears and kind of presents its alternative. And they introduce this word learnography as like a different approach to education. One that moves away from traditional teacher-centered cognitive instruction and instead focuses on learning that's grounded in motor science. So the idea is to make the learners active participants in their own process of acquiring knowledge.
Got it.
Yeah.
And a key element of this learnography approach seems to be this idea of brainpage classrooms. Which they say are designed to help students develop their ability to learn independently through what they call structured rehearsals and motor-driven brainpage formation. Now, that sounds kind of intriguing, but
jargony.
Maybe a bit abstract. Can you break it down a little bit?
Sure. I think of a brain page as a way that the brain organizes and stores information through active engagement. So learnography is suggesting that we can create stronger, more lasting brain pages by involving the motor system. I mean, that's the part of the brain that controls movement and action in the learning process. So motor-driven brain page formation is likely referring to activities that involve physical actions, rehearsals, and active manipulation of information, which helps to really solidify that knowledge in a more embodied and memorable way.
Okay, so instead of just like passively listening to a lecture or
Right.
reading text,
Right.
the learning process involves doing something,
Exactly.
which then helps create these brain pages of understanding.
Hmm.
Now, they outline some specific solutions
Yeah.
to this command problem that
Yeah.
emerge from this learnography framework.
Right.
So what are some of the key strategies?
So one of the main things is to minimize verbal teaching.
Okay.
So instead of relying heavily on direct instruction, lectures, just telling students things, they're suggesting moving towards what they call a book-to-brain learning model.
Okay.
And the emphasis here is on students actively constructing their own understanding through that motor engagement that we were just talking about, rather than just passively receiving information from the teacher.
So less lecture, more hands-on interaction with the material.
Yes.
Okay, what else?
Another key thing is encouraging self-discipline.
Okay.
So moving away from external commands and rules imposed by teachers towards fostering students' ability to generate their own self-commands.
Okay.
Through this brain page creation and tapping into these subconscious learning pathways.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the goal is to cultivate internal motivation and a sense of personal responsibility for their learning journey.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Because if the motivation to learn and to follow through comes from within the student, you're naturally going to encounter less resistance
Totally.
than if it's something that's being imposed on them.
Way less.
Now, they also mentioned something called cyclozeid rehearsal.
Okay.
What is that?
So cyclozeid rehearsal is presented as this method to really improve knowledge retention.
Okay.
It involves engaging in repetitive learning cycles that are specifically designed to activate what's called the subthalamic circuitry in the brain.
Got it.
So the idea is that by repeatedly engaging with material in a particular way, you can more deeply embed that knowledge within these motor circuits, making it more automatic and readily accessible.
Interesting. So it's not just rote repetition.
No.
It's a targeted approach to repetition.
Exactly.
That leverages the brain's motor pathways.
It's all about the motor pathways.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, and then they talk about implementing what they call the Taxshila model.
Right.
And this is their blog is called Taxshila Page. So
yeah, this seems like a central element.
yeah, this seems like a pretty core part of their thinking. So what does that model involve?
Well, the Taxshila model proposes organizing classrooms into what they describe as miniature schools.
Okay.
And in this framework, students are working collaboratively in teams, and they actually take on the role of small teachers for each other.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it's promoting peer-to-peer knowledge transfer and active explanation rather than relying solely on the teacher as like the primary source of information.
So flipping the classroom dynamic.
Exactly.
Instead of the teacher at the front of the room, the students are actively involved in teaching concepts.
Totally. And that can boost engagement so much.
Right, and give them ownership.
Huge ownership.
Over what they're learning.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the last solution that they mention is activating the substantianogra for learning drive.
Oh yeah, this is getting technical.
So that sounds very technical.
It is. So the substantianogra is a region in the brain that plays a key role in reward and motivation.
Okay.
And the article suggests that by designing learning activities that trigger this reward system, you can make knowledge acquisition more intrinsically appealing.
Yeah.
More enjoyable for students.
Make it fun.
Like almost akin to the engagement that they get during play or social activities.
Right.
Those things that naturally activate the limbic system in a positive way.
So it's less of a chore and more of something that they want to do. Exactly. So it seems like the overarching theme here is aligning the learning process with how young brains naturally function.
Yeah.
Right. So moving away from passive reception and external control towards active participation, internal motivation, and even making learning feel more like play.
Working with the brain's natural tendencies.
Yeah.
Rather than against them.
I love that.
Right.
Okay, so they wrap up
do.
with this vision of transforming the traditional classroom,
Yeah.
which they kind of characterize as like potentially a painful teaching environment.
For everyone. For students and teachers.
Into this
Yeah.
happiness classroom of learnography.
It's beautiful.
Pretty aspirational.
Yeah, for sure.
So the idea is by adopting these learnography-based methods, you can address the root causes of that resistance to commands.
Totally.
You can create classrooms that are more effective.
Yes.
And ultimately establish a more sustainable and positive model for education moving forward.
It's about tackling the command problem at its source.
Yeah.
By tapping into the brain's inherent learning mechanisms and cultivating a more student-centered and enjoyable educational experience for everyone.
Okay, so to bring it all together for everyone listening,
Yeah.
the key insight from our deep dive today is that the challenges that we see in traditional education, students not following instructions, lack of engagement, frustration for teachers, stem from this mismatch between how knowledge is typically presented and how younger brains are naturally wired to learn. And learnography proposes that a more effective path forward involves engaging the motor system, fostering self-direction and internal motivation.
Huge.
And fundamentally rethinking how we can make learning more rewarding, less about just complying with those external directives.
It really gives you a lot to think about.
It does. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Like, how could these core principles of actively engaging your motor system and fostering a sense of self-directed learning be applied not just in formal education, but in any learning endeavor that you might undertake in your life? Like, what if the key to understanding and retaining information lies not just in passively absorbing it, but in actively engaging with it? And maybe even incorporating movement into the process.
Like getting your body involved?
Yeah.
That's a really compelling question.
If you're intrigued and want to explore this further, the article encourages you to dig deeper into the concepts of learnography, brainpage, and the Taxshila model.
Yeah, all attributed to Shiva Narayan Taxshila Page.
Yeah, there's a whole philosophy there.
It seems like it.
Ripe for investigation.
Worth exploring.
For sure.